No. This ain't good. I think that's got damaged in the box on the way here because of them sticking out. We still need some modifications to do.
It was clear from the beginning that this stage of the rebuild was never going to be simple. Progress had been made, the interior was coming together, and things were starting to resemble a complete car again. But new problems kept appearing just as quickly as old ones were solved. One of the biggest challenges now sitting in front of them was the cooling system. Even after getting key components back into place, a leaking radiator threatened to undo a lot of that hard-earned progress. Still, despite the setbacks, there was a sense that real momentum had been built. The engine needed to run up to temperature, and there was cautious optimism that it finally could. But that hope depended entirely on solving a problem that most people wouldn't even attempt. The car in question relies on an incredibly complex cooling setup. It isn't just a single radiator doing all the work. It uses 10 separate heat exchangers, each with a specific role. There are units at the front, others on each side managing engine coolant, additional ones handling air temperatures from turbochargers, and more dedicated to transmission and auxiliary systems. Every single one of them is critical when you're dealing with an engine producing around 1,500 horsepower. Under full load, the heat generated is enormous, and without a perfectly functioning cooling system, the entire car is at risk. Unfortunately, several of these radiators had been damaged beyond use in the crash that initially destroyed the vehicle. What made the situation even more frustrating was the lack of support from the manufacturer. Replacement parts weren't available to independent owners, and there was no straightforward way to order what was needed, no official supply chain that could be accessed, and no alternative provided. In most cases, that would be the end of the road. Without those parts, the rebuild would stall indefinitely. But instead of accepting that limitation, Bob approached the problem differently. Rather than waiting weeks or months for something that might never arrive, he decided to build entirely new radiators from scratch, and he did it in just 3 days. That time frame alone is enough to raise eyebrows, but what makes it even more remarkable is how he did it. Instead of sourcing components from the same manufacturer, he identified radiator cores from a completely different vehicle that matched the required specifications closely enough to work. These weren't exotic or rare parts either. They were standard Honda Civic radiator cores that he managed to acquire quickly. It wasn't about brand compatibility, it was about physics. Heat transfer doesn't care what badge is on the front of the car. If the dimensions, flow characteristics, and efficiency are correct, the component will do its job. Bob isn't someone with official certification from a luxury manufacturer, nor does he have any formal backing that would suggest he should be working on a car of this caliber. What he does have is decades of hands-on experience, a deep understanding of materials and fabrication, and the ability to look at a problem and figure out what it actually requires instead of blindly following prescribed procedures. That mindset had already proven valuable earlier in the rebuild, when he repaired a critical gearbox mounting bracket that most people would have written off completely. Instead of discarding it, he reinforced and rebuilt it, making it stronger than it had originally been. The radiator challenge, however, was arguably even more complex. At a glance, a radiator might seem like a straightforward component, but every detail matters. The spacing of the tubes affects how coolant flows through the system. The density of the fins determines how efficiently heat can be dissipated into the air. Even small deviations can result in poor performance, overheating, or restricted airflow. On top of that, the external dimensions must match perfectly, so the unit can be mounted correctly within the car, with all hoses, brackets, and fans aligning exactly where they should. Without access to official specifications, Bob had to rely entirely on the damaged originals. Even though they were bent and partially destroyed, they still contained valuable information. By carefully examining what remained, he was able to extract measurements and reconstruct the design parameters. Tube spacing, fin density, tank size, connection points. Everything had to be interpreted from what was left behind. It was essentially reverse engineering under pressure, with no margin for significant error. Once he understood what he needed, the next step was sourcing suitable cores. That's where the Honda Civic parts came into play. They matched the necessary characteristics closely enough to serve as a foundation. From there, the real work began. The cores themselves were just the starting point. They didn't include any of the fittings or mounting features required for the car. Every connection had to be fabricated from scratch. Aluminum fittings were machined to the correct size and shape, ensuring proper hose routing and sealing. Mounting brackets were built to position each radiator precisely within the chassis, accounting for clearances and alignment with surrounding components. Fan mounts had to be integrated as well, allowing the existing cooling fans to be reused. With all the individual pieces prepared, assembly became the next critical phase. Everything had to come together accurately, with welds that could withstand pressure and heat without failure. This is often where problems reveal themselves, where small measurement errors turn into big fitment issues. In one instance, a bracket ended up being mounted on the wrong side. It wasn't a fundamental flaw in the design, just a simple mistake made during a long stretch of work late at night. It was quickly identified and corrected, and importantly, it didn't compromise the overall functionality of the radiator. Once assembled, the radiators were installed into the car. The main unit was positioned at the front, secured into place, and connected to the cooling system. Hoses were attached, fans mounted, and everything checked for alignment. Then came the side radiators, which were even more impressive considering they had been built without complete original references. Despite that, they slotted into place as if they had been factory-made. The real test, however, was pressure. Introducing pressure into the cooling system would reveal whether the work held up under realistic conditions. If everything was sealed correctly, the system would remain stable. If not, any weakness would immediately become apparent. As pressure built, there was a moment of uncertainty. Then, a faint sound indicated a small leak. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to require attention. Importantly, the issue didn't stem from a fabrication failure. It appeared to be caused by minor damage during handling or transport, something that could happen even with professionally manufactured parts. Instead of treating it as a setback, it was simply another problem to solve. Bob moved to fix it by welding the affected area, continuing forward without hesitation. For that reaction says a lot about the approach taken throughout the entire rebuild. Rather than being discouraged by obstacles, each issue is treated as a step in the process. There's no waiting around for solutions to appear. Solutions are created. When compared to the alternative, the difference becomes even more striking. Going through official channels would likely have meant long delays, uncertain availability, and significant costs, all while remaining dependent on a system that had already proven unhelpful. In contrast, what was achieved here was immediate and effective. Within 3 days, fully functional radiators were designed, built, and installed. They weren't temporary fixes or makeshift compromises. They were complete, working components integrated into a highly complex machine. Aside from a minor leak that was already being addressed, the system was ready to do its job. At its core, this story isn't just about rebuilding a set of radiators. It's about problem solving at a level that goes beyond standard procedures. It highlights the difference between relying on controlled access to parts and having the skill to create what's needed independently. The cooling system is now back in place, the next steps are lined up, and the moment of truth, running the engine and bringing it up to temperature, is getting closer.